Hey everyone, so today's video was about making tea biscuits, and at the end of the recipe I realized that there's a little bit too much liquid in the original recipe. So I'm going to adjust it. So the recipe that you see that comes up in the middle is going to be the adjusted version of it. So through the video you're going to see me referencing 300 mils of milk, but we're actually going to use this 250. Okay, that's going to be to try and dry out the mixture a little bit, because I found that this mixture was a little bit too wet, and that caused the biscuits to not quite be right. Usually they spring up some more. These ones kind of spread out a little bit too much, and I feel that it needed a drier texture for it to be able to maintain its shape and sit still. Okay, so just follow the recipe that goes up and don't worry about when it says 300 mils in the video. Hi everyone, welcome back. On today's episode we're going to be making tea biscuits. So tea biscuits are a very simple type of biscuit. This one is going to be a little bit sweet. So I'm going to throw the recipe up right after this clip. But I enjoyed the biscuit recipe because it doesn't require a lot of ingredients. And a very basic biscuit, all you're going to have is flour, salt, baking powder, butter, and some sort of liquid, and a couple of eggs. So as long as you have those, then you can make biscuits out of it. So I like the sweet version just because I can have it for breakfast and eat it with jam or whatnot. So first thing that we're going to do is take a look at the recipe and then get all of our stuff set up. Alright, so now that you've had a chance to take a look at the recipe, you'll probably notice that you have 3 ingredients on there that are given to you in grams instead of mils or cups. Now, this recipe doesn't have to be precise. If you have a digital scale at home, that works out really well, but if you don't, it's fine. The 500 grams of all-purpose flour ends up being about 3 cups. So 3 cups is what I used in here instead of weighing it out. The 120 grams of butter is about half of a cup. So remember that when you are measuring out butter from the block, you want to use the measurements on the side. Okay, so we would use this to measure half a cup. I just have about half a cup left, so I'm going to use that up. And the last one is 125 grams of sugar right here, and that ends up being about half a cup. Now remember that this recipe would still work out perfectly fine without the sugar. The sugar is just what helps to make this a sweet dough. So if you want it more sweet or less sweet, half a cup is enough to make it pretty sweet. But if you want it less sweet than that, you can always cut back on the sugar and it'll still be okay. Now the last ingredient I wanted to talk about is your 1 teaspoon of salt. Remember that it's important to put this in. Now this is unsalted butter, so I'm going to add in the 1 teaspoon of salt. If you ended up only having salted butter, use that butter and just don't put the salt in. Just remember that salt is important if you have unsalted butter, because this is what helps to give your dough flavor. Your instructions, the first thing that you want to do is make sure that you preheat your oven to 400 degrees. It takes a little bit for it to get to that temperature, so you want to start that off while you make the dough. The dough really doesn't take a long time, so the oven should be heated up right around when all this is going to be ready to go. Okay, so after you set your oven, the first thing that you want to do is mix together your flour, sugar, salt, and baking powder into one bowl. So this is why I put my flour into a big bowl. I'm just going to throw these in here. There's the sugar, the baking powder, and the salt. Okay, now you want to mix these together because that's going to eliminate any clumps. Okay, if you get a clump of salt or a clump of baking powder, it's not very good. So your best bet to do that is to use a wire whisk. Okay, and we just want to mix this together until you have an even mixture. So basically you want everything to look the same. If you can see any chunks in here, so right here, there's a little chunk of baking powder. So I'm just gonna break that up a little bit and then keep mixing. So anytime you see a chunk, just break it up. One of the things that you can do to eliminate that is to run this through a wire strainer. Okay, so if you have one of those, it would look like this. Okay, so if I was going to run that through, let's say into this other bowl. This will help to separate any of the lumps that I might have. Okay, so you just put this into the other container. And then just give it a shake. Okay, the nice thing about this is that it will help to mix the ingredients together and will also help to get rid of some of the lumps. So you can see there's a few lumps in there at the bottom. One of the things I can do is just push that through and this will break down the size. Right? So just be a little bit more careful than I was here. You want to try and avoid losing some of this flour. This is probably a good time to remind you that if you get flour on the counter, you don't want to wipe that up with a wet cloth because then it's just going to muck up your cloth. So just get most of the solids off if possible, and then you can wipe the rest of it up with a dry cloth. Okay, so that's step one. The next step that we're going to have is to mix the butter in. My metal bowl had a little bit more room in it, so I decided to move all of the ingredients from the plastic one back over here. So I have my half a cup of butter, and I want to be mixing this in here, but right now you can see that my half a cup is just this big chunk. Okay, so what I'm going to do to make things a little bit easier with the mixing, I'm going to cut this up into a few smaller chunks, and that'll make it easier for me to mix in. So just do that. There. So it doesn't matter how many pieces you cut it into, just make it so that they're small enough that you can handle them pretty easily. Okay, so I'm going to put that in with my flour. Get the rest of that in there. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just cover that with some flour. Okay, the only reason I'm doing that is as I'm breaking up the butter, this will make it so that it doesn't really stick to my hands or my fingers. It's really annoying when that happens. So basically what you want to do is just mix it together, and as you go through, I'm going to press on these to break them into smaller pieces. Okay, as I do that, just mix it through again to cover those with flour, and we're going to keep doing that. What we want to do is keep breaking this up until we get to the mealy stage. Okay, the mealy stage is when this is going to be completely broken in. Okay, so the pieces are going to be really small, and you shouldn't be able to pick out any big chunks. If you have a food processor, this is probably faster to do in there. All you do is add in your flour and your butter and just pulse it until you've cut up all of the butter into really small pieces. Okay, so just keep mixing until you have it broken up. We'll be back once this is completely broken up into the mealy stage. So I'm all done mixing it up. It took me maybe another minute of mixing or so. So what you're looking for is this kind of grainy looking dough. So all the butter is pretty small. It's a lot of them are about the size of a grain of rice. So as you go through, you can't really get any really large pieces in there. So this is really what we're looking for. If you still have a few big chunks in there, it's okay. Like, these aren't that big. So our next step is going to be mixing the wet ingredients together. Okay, so I got my 300 mils of milk and I have my 2 eggs. So I'm just going to add my eggs to the milk, and then I need to mix those together. So again, if you have a whisk, that's the best way to go, but if you don't, you could always just grab a fork and just mix those together. Okay, this is still just a basic recipe, so if you wanted to add something else in there, so if you wanted to put a little bit of vanilla or something, that would actually work out really well in this recipe. So you would only need about half a teaspoon or 1 teaspoon to get good flavor out of it. Okay, it just depends on what you want your product to taste like at the end. Make sure you hold on to your fork because you're going to want to use that. Okay, so we'll get this back, and I'm going to make a little well. It doesn't really matter if you make the well or not. I just find that this helps to keep the liquids contained to a certain area. Okay, so I'm going to pour that in the middle. And the reason I have this fork is I'm going to use this to do some of my preliminary mixing. Okay, so if I just stick my hands in there right away, it's going to be really goopy. and all that's going to get stuck to my fingers. So what I'm going to do instead, use this fork to mix some of this together. So this mixture ends up being pretty wet, which is actually okay for our purposes because I'm just going to dust the counter with a little bit of flour and then just pat it into shape. Okay. If you find that it's really wet, just add a little bit more flour just to dry it out. Since we're in Alberta, the air is always dry, so these recipes usually work out okay. Okay. So this looks a little bit wet for what I want to do. So I'm just going to grab some flour and then we'll try and dry this out a little bit. Now I don't know exactly how much flour I'm going to need, so I grabbed about a cup just because I'm going to have to put some on the counter anyway. So just sprinkle a little bit in at a time because you don't want to add too much. That makes it much more difficult to fix. Okay. Basically I just want this to dry out enough that I can actually handle it without it sticking completely to my hands. Okay, I think that will do it. Okay, it's starting to release a little bit from the bowl. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to start sprinkling a little bit of flour on here. This will just make it so that it doesn't stick to the counter because that's going to be really annoying trying to put it onto a sheet if it's stuck to the counter. Okay. Now remember that this is just a very basic sweet biscuit recipe. Now if you wanted to say put chocolate chips in it or put in some dried fruit like dried blueberries or cranberries or currants or whatever, you totally can. It just depends on what you want this to taste like when you're done with it. You're going to sprinkle a little bit more flour on top here. And I'm just going to gently pat this into shape. I want it to be about, we'll say 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch thick, because it's still going to rise up a lot when I bake it. Okay, so just going to pat that down. Okay, while you're doing this, if you're not sure how thick 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch is, you basically want it to be about the thickness of your thumb. You're better off leaving them a little thick than a little thin. If they get too thin, they don't rise quite enough, and then when you try and bake them, they're not going to be very thick. So that makes it difficult for you to cut them in half and put stuff on them when they're done. All right, so I think that's pretty good. If you have a rolling pin, you can use that to try and smooth out the surface a little bit if you want, but it doesn't really matter because we're going to end up cutting these out anyway. In most tea biscuit recipes, what they do is they'll use a circle cutter or glass to make rounds. My only issue with that is it wastes some of the dough because you have to re-roll it. And you can re-roll this dough. I would only re-roll it once. But usually what I'll do is I'll form this into a bit of a rectangle, and then using a knife I would just cut this like so. And then I would just have some rectangular pieces. So if you want to do that, you certainly can. That'll make it so that you can use up all the dough right at once. I'm going to grab a glass just in case if you want to see how you'd make a round version. So just grab your cup, and before you do that, the first thing you want to do is make sure you have a sheet pan ready. So I have a 9x13 sheet pan or cookie sheet. This is a half sheet pan. So make sure that you put a liner down. This is a silicone liner, which makes it so that things don't stick to it. If you don't have this, that's fine. Just use parchment paper. That'll also make sure that things don't stick. So once you have that ready, you can start cutting these out. You want to start from the edge because that'll use up as much of this as possible. Okay, so give it a bit of a twist. This dough's a little wet, so it makes it a little bit difficult to get those out of there. But here's your round piece, so let's put that on there. One of the things that people do is they'll run these through a little bit of flour to try and prevent it from sticking. It kind of works, but okay, number 2. Okay, and then just keep doing that until you've cut them all out. Okay, so I managed to cut out 6 rounds, and then I'm left with the rest of this dough. So you can see that it's still pretty wet, which is good for us because that means that I should be able to mix this back together pretty easily. Okay, so remember that we don't want to overwork this, so we don't want to be kneading it or anything like that, because that's going to make it tough. So basically just mix it enough so that it gets back together, and then just reflour the surface. Okay, so now that I have this left over, I'm not going to re-roll this again, so instead of cutting out rounds, what I'm just going to do here is I'm going to cut this into, we'll say 3 pieces, and those will be my last biscuits. So just grab any sort of cutting tool, if you have a knife or paring knife or whatever. I'm just going to use this plastic cutter. So there's 1, and 2 and 3. Okay. Make sure you space these out pretty well on your cookie sheet. They are still going to expand, but you don't want to overload the sheet. So if you have 2 sheets, this will probably work out better. You could put about 4 or 5 on each one. And then if you don't have a sheet, it's fine. Just cook the first batch, and when those are done, you can put on the second batch. We're gonna do something to the top. So I'm gonna leave, this isn't in the directions, I don't believe. I'm gonna have to double check. But one of the things that you can do to the tops of these is put either cream or some egg wash on it. Okay, the egg wash is just gonna be an egg with a little bit of water added to it to thin it out. But when you put it on, it gives it a really nice shiny texture. And the other thing you can do is put a little bit of raw sugar on, or turbinado sugar if you have it. So just a large crystal sugar on the top, and I would only do that for a sweet dough. Okay, so put yours onto the cookie sheet, and then we're going to coat some of them so that we can see what they look like. So I ended up having 2 sheets, so I could put both of mine in at the same time. So what I'm going to do, this sheet is going to be my non-egg wash sheet. So let's get that out of the frame. And these ones I am going to egg wash. So this is my wash right here. This was just an egg with a little bit of water in it. So make sure you have a brush. If you have a silicone brush, it still works out fine. I just like these ones because it seems to cover the area a lot better. So you just want to brush a little bit of this on the top. Okay, so cover all of these. And I end up having raw sugar and turbinado sugar. So we'll use a little bit of each one just so we can take a look at the difference for those guys too. So if you've ever seen raw sugar, it comes in something like this. We got this from the grocery store. It's pretty common. There's really no difference between sugar and raw sugar, just that raw sugar hasn't been washed as many times, so it has that brownish color to it. So when you look at it, you can see it says natural turbinado sugar. So throw a little bit of that on there. Okay. And this is the turbinado sugar that I got from Bulk Barn. So you can see that this pretty much has the same size and color. I used to think that the grains were a little bit bigger, but I've never used them side by side. So yeah, if you just get some raw sugar from the grocery store, this ends up making a really nice topping. Gives it a little bit extra texture and a little bit of sweetness. It makes it so that you don't actually have to put anything on these, you can just eat them straight. So what we're going to do now, we're going to put both of the biscuits into the oven at the same time. I have 2 shelves. So we're going to bake them at 400 degrees, and the whole thing usually takes about 10 to 15 minutes. What I'm going to do is after about 7 or 8 minutes, I'm going to take the one on the bottom shelf and move it to the top, and then take the one on the top shelf and move it to the bottom. And the strategy behind that is if I leave, we'll say this one on the bottom the whole time, the bottoms of these are going to get really brown because that's where the heat source is. So I want to switch them around so that neither one gets too brown, and each one is going to have an even amount of cooking. Okay, so let's say I put them in like this. These ones would be really brown on the bottom. These ones would be really brown on the top. But if I end up switching them, then you get an even shade for both. Right, so these got out of the oven and they've been cooling down for a couple minutes. Remember that it's going to be important for you to let these cool before you cut them open and eat them or fill them, just because you want the structure to set completely. After making these, I'm looking at the final product and it didn't turn out quite the way it normally does. I feel as though there's a little too much liquid in it. So at the beginning, we're just going to try and change the recipe from 300 mils to 250. I feel like cutting it back just a little bit will help out. You might still have to add some flour to it, but the mixture should be a little bit drier than what we had. Okay, so if we take a close look at them, this is the one that didn't have egg wash on it. So you can see it's kind of a matted finish and it's kind of dull, and yeah. It's okay. It's going to turn out exactly the same as the other one, just I don't like how it looks. So this is the one that had egg wash and a little bit of sugar on it. It's a lot nicer, has like a nice sheen on it, it's a little bit shiny. So this is the whole reason why we usually do that. So when you look at them side by side, there is a noticeable difference. This one's a little bit more appealing than this one. It doesn't really matter if you use the egg wash or not. It just is going to affect how it looks. You basically want to bake these until you have a nice golden brown finish. So it's light brown on the outside, and at the bottom it's also light brown. So you can see that these are about the same on the bottom. Remember what I said before, that if we left one on the bottom, this would be really dark and one of these would be really light. So we're just going to cut these open so you can see what it looked like on the inside. They should feel pretty light, and when you cut these open, they should be pretty airy. Okay, so you want to, if you want to, you can put some jam on it or just eat them as is. Okay, so go forth and have some fun.